Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Well, this is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streamed every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Tonight, restoring rational local management of our national forests by abolishing the Roadless Rule. That's what we're going to be talking about. Now, y'all remember that Klaus Schwab has repeatedly told us you will own nothing and you will be happy. Now, he also told us you will eat the bugs, but that's another issue I'm not going to get into tonight. But the right to own private property that cannot be arbitrarily regulated or confiscated by the government is the moral and constitutional basis for individual freedom. We know that. As long as you can own property, access it, and use it for your own profit or pleasure, you are free. You are a free individual. Now, governments don't like that, especially a government that is growing more powerful than allowed by our Constitution and is progressing rapidly down a path toward totalitarian control of every aspect of your life. The Constitution allows the federal government to own 10 square miles of land for the Capitol building, as well as additional land for military bases, post roads, post offices, and the land necessary to implement the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. Nevertheless, the feds have gained control of millions of acres of public land using a long list of bureaucratic rules and regulations without direct congressional oversight and in direct contradiction to the Constitution. The Roadless Rule prohibits the building of roads on 45 million acres of public land that is largely under the control of the U.S. Forest Service. Now, they call it public land, but without roads, we the people do not have access to use and enjoy the land that we constitutionally own. Tom Schultz, head of the Forest Service, said, and I'm quoting, "There is this inherent narrative that's out there somewhere. If we want to protect something, we leave it alone. That's a fallacy. That's a false narrative." And he is absolutely correct. So my guest tonight is Frank Carroll, a managing partner of Professional Forest Management, LLC. Frank is a former U.S. Forest Service senior official and holds a Master of Public Administration from a very prestigious institution. So I have to ask you, Frank, and first of all, I have to welcome you. Welcome you to this episode of Freedom Forum Radio Live. And I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, so we've talked about the Roadless Rule. And what I want to say, first of all, is what exactly is the Roadless Rule? Now, I know that you know a whole bunch about forests and about forest fire, about wildfire. So I know what you know. I know you know what the Roadless Rule is. But what is the impact of the Roadless Rule on you and me?
You know, before we get to that, let's go back to 1670. And the Parliament, as you recall, the English had just completed their Civil War. Cromwell was dead. He terrorized Ireland, subjugated Scotland, trapped the Welsh and forced them to submit to the king, Charles II, and James after him. And and they decided they needed the king back. They didn't like the autocratic rule that Cromwell brought to the table, so they brought the king back. Only they had some limitations and differences from the past. One of the key provisions of the new parliament and the new order with the king was pretty straightforward, and it was that private property is inviolable, and that no more on English soil could the king just willy-nilly take somebody's private property and give it away to somebody else for any reason. And so our foundation of private property goes far back, but the current status of private property, and the one to which we adhere so strongly in this country, was both a product of the Parliament of 1670 and the deal with Charles II and James after him, and then our own American values that we brought from Great Britain, which is stay the hell off of our place. And not only that, we have a public commons for a reason. The other major sort of pathway or stream that was occurring at that time was the removal of the people who worked the land in favor of wealthy lords who owned sheep. And they just went in with the government and threw people out of Scotland, sent them to Australia and America, and threw people off of the land in Wales and so on, and stole that property, which was the public commons before, or privately held, but mostly the public commons, stole that property for their own economic purposes. And that's very much what happened in this country in 1999, starting in 99, and then it became the rule in 2001, the Roadless Rule. And what happened was a cabal of environmental interests conspired through Al Gore with his willing participation and the then Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to identify 60 million acres of land that was roadless, or that in their view should have been roadless. And they essentially stole it from the American people by locking it up under an egregious set of rules that allowed no road building, allowed no timber sales, allowed no multiple use of any kind on those lands. And remember that the National Forest System, for example, is 192 million acres. So 60 million acres was a huge piece of country. Lots of pieces of country, but a huge percentage of that number. And so this fight over the Roadless Rule and the way people felt about it, both in 1999 when it was first proposed and in 2001 when it was egregiously implemented, in spite of what everybody wanted to do or had to say about it, especially on a local basis, is an ancient, old fight that's brought countries to war over this principle. And so, here we sit today with the Trump administration rightly deciding to rescind the rule, and they will rescind the rule. There's no vote. There was no vote in 2001 where everybody got to raise their hand and vote about whether we wanted roadless. And there'll be no vote now. This is an administrative fait accompli, and we're just spinning our wheels for the sake of form, which is also an ancient English and French tradition. If you're going to kill the king, you want to try to find some reason going all the way back to Roman law about why it's okay in this case. And if you can't find one, you do it anyway, and then you invent something, and then you kill some of the perpetrators, and it's all good. And so all of these cultural, social, and political streams are very old, ancient methods in our country of doing business, and we're in the middle of the current impetus, which is get rid of the Roadless Rule and take it back to the rational decision process that started in 1980.
Well, Frank, you brought up history, and really the 1990s is an important point to bring up, because it was in 1992 that the United Nations announced Agenda 21, their plans for taking over control of planet Earth in all aspects. And that was in 1992. And after that came the Wilderness, the Wildlands Treaty, in which would have turned almost all of the United States into wilderness, with a small number of areas that were designated as human areas, and the rest would be left as wilderness. And that was in 1994 when that treaty was brought to the Senate for ratification. And K. Bailey Hutchinson showed that map that Michael Kaufman put together. And when the senators saw that, what that actually meant, what that treaty actually meant, they did not ratify the treaty, fortunately. So what I see, the Roadless Rule and that all those machinations of the late 1990s, the 1999, was just a continuation of all of those efforts. And you know that the basis for all of that stuff was Clinton's executive order 12852, which established the President's Council on Sustainable Development. That council then went and put forth a huge number of rules, regulations, suggestions, and plans by which the federal government could oust the people from the land they owned, herd them into small cities so they could be controlled better. And so the wilderness, the roadless rule, was just part of that effort on the part of the federal government. Al Gore, the Clinton administration, all of that comes together with the United Nations and as part of the Agenda 21 initiative, now the Agenda 2130 initiative, but it's the same thing. The UN wants to control Mother Earth, and the only way they can do it is by killing us off, a smaller number, by taking our land away from us. And that's basically what you and I are talking about tonight.
Well, so the idea of all of that is true. And the idea of the commons, that, in any society, there's always a need for land that's owned in common. And it's an ancient concept. It's held true in every country, in every situation, even in the Pashtun. And there's a massive, amount of public commons where people are free to do various things, hunt and fish and live and cut timber, whatever it happens to be. And so control of the commons has long been a feature of government's exercise of power, especially as government moves forward in strength and imperial machinations and desires and so on, to the extent that the more that they can directly control, the more they can control their political and social agendas. And so in this case, the Roadless Rule of 2001 was absolutely an outcome of the desire on the part of the Democrats at that point in time, which hasn't really changed through the years, and their environmental allies to steer society in a specific way for their own political and social purposes. And to do that, they require control of the commons. No timber cutting, no grazing, no all of these fights that we've been fighting since the 1950s about who gets to use the public lands and how. And so, I'm sorry, excuse me. Who gets to use the public lands and how? And so 2001 was a watershed moment when those public lands came under the direct control of a political party for their own political purposes. And of course, that was an egregious blow to everybody else who didn't agree with that, and to rural communities who died as a result of that action, and to people who had to leave for cities and come under the sway of government welfare and that sort of thing, because their livelihoods have been taken away from them based on ridiculous scientific and political precepts that had no basis in reality. And so that's what's being, a great wrong is being righted in terms of government's role on the public commons. And the public commons are being turned back to the public by this administration, and that's positive.
Well, again, what we're talking about is the desire of a small group of wealthy elite people on Earth to control mankind. And it goes back centuries, really. In the Middle Ages, the kings, queens, and dukes and duchesses, they owned everything. They controlled everything, whether you earned a living, whether you lived or died, or what happened to you was in the control of a handful of people who did have all the money. They owned everything. It's basically what it is. The American Revolution came and we threw them out. We absolutely threw them out, and to the point where the Constitution says that our government cannot confer titles of nobility. And it's for that reason. They were sick and tired of being ruled by kings, queens, dukes, and duchesses, and the like. And they didn't want any of that here. And as a result, they said, no. Well, what has happened slowly since then is that the sons and daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, great grandsons, and granddaughters of all of those wealthy people, they want back in, and they have the money to get back in. And they have been doing things with their money in order to take over everything that they want again, because they want to be back in control. And they have the money to fund environmental groups, to buy congressmen and senators and governments. And that's what they're doing, isn't it?
It's appalling to me. And it's so funny. The premise of the current roadless rule is that we few are smarter than all the rest of you. We know it's good for you, and you don't. And therefore, we're going to impose our will on you by these various regulations, rules, stipulations, and so on about what you can do with our public lands, our public commons. And the reason we're doing that, Dr. Dan, is to hold these lands in trust for the future generations who need to have wild lands that they can make decisions about. The problem with that, Dr. Dan, as we've talked about before, is that the taking no action on something is an action. And in this case, taking no action or locking those lands up and not allowing road building or timber cutting and those sorts of things is resulting in those lands burning to the ground from neglect. And so the very thing that those people in their myopic vision and their silliness and their egregious illegal actions, the very thing that they tried to achieve, putting a dome over that 60 million acres like Disneyland so it would be untouched by dirty human beings, has been upended and destroyed by their own perfidy and by their own ignorance and their own myopic, self-centered, selfish view. And so we were talking earlier about just in the last few months, the amount of old growth forest that's burned to the ground in this country as a result of these wrong-headed decisions about fire control and about allowing fire to come back into fire depleted ecosystems, they're calling it now. The result of all of that is that the old trees that they were trying to save, the 120 plus year old trees, 300, 400 year old trees, 1,000-year-old trees and the sequoias and so on, are burning to the ground because of this limited, goofy action of these few people over the entire American people. It's ridiculous, it's wrong, and it's going to end.
Well, what we're seeing is, again, it's all due to greed and a lust for power. But that's what is driving the entire movement to lock away land. And you're right. If you have huge acreage of forests without roads, it is inevitable that they will burn. Because what happens? Trees live, trees die, they fall on the ground. If they're not cleaned up, that is just additional fuel in case a fire starts. But it's more than that. It is the effort to keep people off this land, not just to keep them physically off it, but to prevent them from using the land as a source of recreation, food, commerce. And that's what they're doing.
Oh,
They're
no,
taking,
Dr. Dan, you misunderstand. They tell us that there's no restriction on people going onto this 60 million acres, Dr. Dan. Why no? Anybody can go there as long as you're not in a wheelchair, you're not 70 years old, you don't have a gimp leg, you can breathe okay at 8,000 feet. As long as you're a perfectly well environmental activist, it's wide open to you as long as you don't bring anything but a toothbrush.
Well, that's the problem, though, because and I know what you're saying. We can't use that land. That land becomes ours, but it is not ours because it's useless to it. We do not have access. Therefore, we cannot use it for profit or recreation. Therefore, it is not ours.
And
Hey,
that's one of the tragedies, one of the great tragedies of this story is that starting in 1980, the government, through the Council on Environmental Quality and through other mechanisms, began a rational planning process. And the essence of the planning process was to sit down locally. There are 192 million acres and 100, and I can't remember now because there's been a lot of consolidation, but let's say there's 120 national forests. And the charge that we had was to sit down locally with all the different interests and have a thoughtful conversation over several years about how we should use a particular national forest, the public lands of a national forest, usually about 2 million acres of land in a local area. And we've been working on these things for since 1980, and we'd made great strides. All forests had plans published by then. We were working through these things locally. And so what the environmental community did was a betrayal on the scale of the betrayal of Scotland by the camels of Argyll at Glencoe and Culloden. It was a catastrophic betrayal of all of these principles and all the work. For 20 years, we sat down together and built informed consent. Informed consent doesn't mean you necessarily like what we're all going to do together, but you're informed. You had a part in that role. You had a role in it. Your ideas came forward. Some of that land's going to be wilderness. Some of it's going to be timber. Some of it's going to be mining, et cetera, et cetera. The environmentalists threw all that in the ditch, and all of the local people that they were working with and betrayed all of us in the government and outside and had this monster imposed on top of us. It was wrong at the time. It's doubly wrong now, and it's going to end. And I'm excited.
yes, you're right that it does have to end. But what you're talking about again is the fact that these groups have an enormous war chest, enormous funding, and they were able to buy support in order to bypass that and destroy that cooperative effort that we had for decades. Because I remember where we live, I live in a rural area. We had a timber industry that was very active. They could go onto national lands, they were allowed to cut timber. We had three uh, sawmills in the county. But what happened was, as this land got locked away, it got locked away from them. They couldn't cut timber. And as a result, we have no sawmills left in our county at all. And all those people, many of them just gave up on timber cutting or they had to go elsewhere. But that was part of that cooperative effort. And recreation is the same thing. The ability to go and camp out, to drive a vehicle to an area, pitch a tent, spend the night, and have your family or friends together with you. Those are the things that go away when government comes in heavy-handed with regulations. And when the environmental community are the ones with the money, that's what they want. They don't want us there. And they've been able to buy the power to keep us out.
Amen. And that's why there's such resistance to the Trump administration. We have a practical, fully American businessman in charge now, and he's at a point in his career when he doesn't have to worry about the next step. And he's had 8 years now to see how he was rolled in his first administration by those very interests that you describe, that he calls the swamp. And he's had 4 years to plan what to do about it in the interregnum, I call it, the time between kings. And so here he is today enacting this very thoughtful program that took a long time to plan and is taking a short time to implement. So it's ruffling feathers, but it's good.
Well, you've really picked on something that I think is very important to understand about Donald Trump. When he came to Washington originally, he was a CEO of major companies, and he had no idea how Washington worked. He had no idea that he did have to play a certain amount of gamesmanship in order to get support and get what he wanted. So that first term was a difficult one for him. He got some things done, but he was kind of swimming against the current of not just Congress, but against the regulators, the bureaucrats. And we have to face it. The bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. is what runs the show. It's completely out of control. They do not answer to us. We cannot vote them out of office. They are untouchable. And that is the one part of government in Washington that needs to be eliminated. We can no longer have bureaucracy running things without any oversight at all. But you're right. Trump went for 4 years out of power, and he looked back at the first 4 and he said, okay, I am going to be a success. And now I understand how to do it. And so when he was reelected, he hit the ground running. And I think that he's done some phenomenal things. People need to have patience because it's going to take a little time for things to work. But he knows how to do it now, and he knows what to do. And it's going to be a success.
And he's unswayed by the voices yelling foul, foul, because those are foul voices.
So the roadless rule, again, it had a negative impact in many areas. Why don't you go over that just a little bit? Because it's important people understand why roadless is against their best interest.
I'd like to just refer to something here real quick. And the roadless rule, in essence, and it was established in 2001, but it was set on its course in 1999. And there are a number of tales about that are hair-raising in terms of what the then Democrat administration forced the bureaucrats that ran the Forest Service, great leaders, people I knew and loved very well, to do toward that end. But it established prohibitions on road construction, road reconstruction. So if there was a road there, this was one of the wonderful things about this, if you were a liberal, I guess, if there was a road already there and it was used by the counties or whatever, there are almost wars that broke out over those roads because the roadless rule didn't allow the counties then to go in and maintain roads that they'd been using for years for all kinds of purposes. So no new road construction, no reconstruction, no timber harvesting, and the only thing they couldn't stop was mining because the 1872 Mining Act is so bulletproof. So they couldn't stop mining, but they could make it so hard to do that, people had to think hard about whether they would do it. On 60 million acres of inventoried roadless areas. Inventoried by who? Well, inventoried by the environmental groups and their handlers. And so they did egregious things like they called them cherry stems. If there was a road that everybody was using and it went into the county someplace pretty deep, 10, 15, 20 miles or whatever, and it was critical for some use, the environmentalists drew a cherry stem around that road and declared that it was roadless on either side of the road into the area that whatever it was supporting. And so the roadless rule today applies to nearly 45 million acres of land altogether on national forest system lands, including Alaska. And so that rule essentially, philosophically, you have to believe that human beings have no role in the human environment, that we have no natural role in nature, that somehow we were put here by aliens, and that all the things around us, teddy bears and unicorns and, fairies and all the rest of it, were here naturally, but we weren't. And if you believe that way, then you can say to yourself, we should establish Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is going to be this vast interconnected earth, land masses of earth, in a way that keeps people confined in these small zoo-like enclosures, and everything else is wide open to only those who can hike and take pictures, and only those who think that that's a good thing to do. And so I'm being very facetious, but for so many reasons, that's literally what they've done in this case on a grand total of 60 million acres. 60 million acres. An acre is a little bit smaller than a football field, but 60 million football fields, that's a lot of football. And so it's wrong. That's not the way we do business in America. It's contrary to our common law, to English law, to Roman law, to the vast body of law that came before us, and then upon which our institutions and our government are built. And so when they did this, it was a deeply cynical, deeply destructive, wrong-headed thing that resulted in the trashing of the very things that they were trying to preserve. And so for that reason, people need to know that the Roadless Rule was a straight up political construction of one party in power at the time, that it was maintained through I don't know why, through the lack of attention or caring of other administrations that came after, until President Trump. And what President Trump is saying very simply is, we're going to get rid of that rule altogether. We're going to start over where we left off in 1998. And we're going to go back to having local conversations and building informed consent for how all of us are going to use these lands. And it's not going to be a big vote by cynical environmental groups who paid 200,000 people to make comments and called it a democratic process. It's not about a vote. It's about our inheritance, which is inherently our public commons. And a small group of people don't get to decide. We all get to decide together through a rational planning process, and that's where it's headed. There's nothing on earth that'll stop that from happening, in spite of all there's 600,000 comments now in favor of keeping the Roadless Rule. No, there's not, and it doesn't matter.
Well, I think you've explained it very well, Frank. Now, I think that's very important that people understand. They understand that the Roadless Rule came into being fraudulently, essentially, and it was allowed to stand by inaction. And now finally, someone, Donald Trump, as president, has stood up and said, this is wrong. It's against our philosophy of private property, our philosophy that the public commons belongs to the public, and everyone has the right to participate in the use for profit or recreation or whatever purposes of the public commons, because it is exactly that. It is the public commons. I think that pretty much is what you've been saying.
That's exactly right. I mean, to me, there's no mystery here. I think the only mystery, there was a generation of environmentalists, like friends of mine in the Idaho Conservation League and the Wilderness Society and various groups, who spent the last 25 years thinking that this whole thing was settled, a political outcome that was settled and put to bed, and it'll never rear its head again. And I know many of them are surprised. A number of them are retired now, and they're kind of coming back up out of their chairs, but they need to sit down, because what they did and what they supported was wrong. It was egregious. It was anti-American. It was deeply unfortunate, deeply dishonest, and it's being overturned. Hallelujah. Rescind the Roadless Rule.
Yeah, and in addition to that, there's one aspect that we haven't really talked about, and that is the fact that these wilderness areas are prone to fire. And those fires, if they are let to burn, which they are, because you can't access them that easily, especially if there's no roads, that poses a risk and danger to all of us, does it not?
So that's very interesting. In 2003, there was a giant fire that started in the wildlands outside of Canberra, the capital, the Australian Capital Territory in Australia. And when the fire forces of Canberra, the capital, tried to attack the fire, they found out that all the roads that they'd used for the previous 100 years to control fire and to manage the lands around the capital and so on had been closed by these same environmental myopic narrow interests that had decided that having roads was a bad thing. And as a result of that, as a result of multiple lightning fires our winter of 2003, these fires were able to build a head of steam overnight to burn together and to burn into the capital and burn over 500 homes and principal buildings, plantations, all kinds of stuff on the way into the capital and in the capital city itself. And that's the same, we're having the same experience now. What you can't access, you can't manage. And what you can't manage, you abandon that to management that has nothing to do with you. It has to do with insects and wildfires and forest disease and overgrown thickets of trees that have no chance to survive. And so for so many reasons, the environmentalists would like the American public to believe that if we just follow their ideas, it's like putting a big glass dome over the forest like Disneyland. And once in a while you can go in and touch up a few tree limbs with some paint and so on, but just leave it alone, it'll be perfect. That's not at all what happens. What happens in the absence of management is management by natural disaster. And so these massive fires that are now burning through these roadless areas, by the way, and reducing these ancient forests that they were trying to protect to ash, there's no human response that's adequate in that situation because there's no access to these lands. These are our lands. They're not their, they don't belong to the environmental groups. They're not their little social political experiment. These are our lands. These are my forests. That's my clean water. That's my clean air. And no, you can't have it. We can decide how we're going to use it together, but we're going to decide in a rational planning model with informed consent of the parties.
Frank Carroll of Wildfire Pros, and that's wildfirepros.com if you want to go to his website. I think you've about said it all.
I'm plumb out of steam.
That means that I hope that doesn't mean the fire has gone out.
Oh no, the fire burns bright.
Thank you so very, very much for a really good discussion. And I hope people understand the importance of what you've said. These are the public lands. Everybody has the right to decide how they're used, not just a few small groups of well-funded people who have an ulterior motive. So
Perfectly said.
thank you very much for being a guest on Freedom Forum Live. And I look forward to having you back again. There's always plenty to talk about when it comes to forests and fires.
Thank you, Dr. Dan.
And thank you, Frank Carroll.